The New York we find in 1775 is a strange creature, squeezed onto the southern tip of a wild Manhattan. For a modern spectator, the scale would be shocking. The city ends abruptly at Chambers Street. Beyond that, what we today call Soho, Greenwich Village, and Central Park are merely rolling hills, apple orchards, and the vast freshwater pond, a deep lake located where the court system stands today. The population is a dense mass of 25,000 souls, packed into red brick and wooden houses, lining streets that have never seen a square. Broadway is already the backbone, but it is a dirt road that, in summer, kicks up clouds of dust that choke the lungs, and in winter, becomes a river of black, viscous mud that swallows a man's boots. The rhythm of life is dictated by bells. The bell of St. Paul's Chapel marks the start of the artisan's workday. The harbor bell announces the arrival of a West Indies ship with molasses and enslaved people. The tavern bell signals that the night's politics have begun. There is no rush, but there is a nervous intensity. The New Yorker of 1775 knows they live in a privileged geographic location, but one that is politically cursed. Imagine you are a blacksmith named Thomas, living in an attic near Maiden Lane. Your day begins at 4 in the morning, not with an alarm, but with the biting cold that has solidified the water in the ceramic basin beside your bed. The first task isn't checking the news, but lighting the fire. Firewood is the gold of colonial New York. Almost all the wood on the island has already been cut for construction or heating, and now it must be brought in by barges from New Jersey or the Bronx. If the river freezes, you will starve or freeze to death. Breakfast has no coffee. Coffee is expensive, and tea is politically dangerous. You drink a mug of fermented apple cider and eat a slice of hard rye bread. As you walk to the workshop, the smell of the city hits you like a punch. It is the stench of 25,000 people without sanitation. The Holy Ground, as the neighborhood near Trinity Church was ironically called, is a labyrinth of alleys where human waste is thrown directly into the gutters. At the docks, the noise is deafening. The creaking of hemp ropes, the shouts of stevedores in 10 different languages, and the constant thud of caulkers' hammers trying to keep ships afloat. New York is a city of manual mechanical noises. Every object you touch, the nail in your boot, the horseshoe for your horse, the plate you eat from, was handmade with sweat and clamor. Let's talk about prices. For nothing defines routine better than the cost of living. In 1775, inflation began to erode the social fabric. A skilled laborer earns about 4 shillings a day. A kilogram of pork costs 4 pence. It seems cheap, but when the crown's taxes on sugar, glass, and paper begin to take effect, the balance disappears. The heart of commercial life is the fly market asterisk. Imagine the chaos. Street vendors shout the qualities of their oysters, which at the time were so abundant they were considered poor man's food. Oysters 8 inches long were harvested directly from the then clean waters of the Hudson and sold on every corner. For the poor New Yorker, the oyster was what saved the family from starvation when the price of wheat spiked. In this market, you see the true face of New York: diversity. You hear Old Dutch spoken by wealthy families who still control the land, the German of recent immigrants, the dialect of enslaved Africans, and the sharp English of naval officers. It is a commercial Babel, but in 1775, transactions are tense. If you pay with British currency, you are seen as a loyalist. If you try to use colonial notes, you could be arrested. Money has become a declaration of war. New York women in 1775 were not just housewives. They were logistics managers in an imminent conflict zone. For a woman like Mary, the wife of a leather merchant, the routine involves cottage industry. With the boycott of British goods, women returned to spinning wool at home. Having a loom in the living room was an act of patriotic rebellion. Cleaning was a losing battle. Coal dust from the fireplaces covered everything. Washing clothes meant lugging buckets of water from the tea water pump, which was far away, boiling the water in large iron cauldrons, and scrubbing heavy linen until knuckles bled. And there was the constant threat of smallpox. Mothers examined their children every morning for red spots. Vaccination was experimental and dangerous, and the city lived in cycles of mourning. In the afternoons, these women gathered, but not for tea. Liberty tea was made from raspberry leaves or local herbs. There, they exchanged information. Who was illegally hoarding flour? Which neighbor had hosted a British officer for dinner? The network of female gossip was, in fact, the revolution's first intelligence network in Manhattan. If you want to know what's happening, you go to the tavern. There are no fast daily newspapers. There are pamphlets. Places like King's Head or Francis Tavern are the city's lungs. The air inside is a mixture of pipe tobacco smoke and alcohol vapor. In 1775, taverns were divided. If you walk into the wrong tavern, wearing the wrong hat, you might not come out in one piece. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Isaac Sears, used these places to plan raids on British armories. They were the radicals of the time, artisans and sailors with nothing to lose. They drank rum punch. Rum came from the triangular trade with the West Indies, and sang defiant songs. On the other side, loyalists in more refined taverns drank Madeira wine and lamented the madness of the rebels. To them, the British crown was the only thing preventing New York from falling into total anarchy. The routine of Manhattan was this constant divide. You didn't just cross the street, you crossed ideological lines that separated brothers. We cannot speak of realism without facing the deepest scar of the New York routine, the slave market on Wall Street. Yes, the street that is today the symbol of global capitalism began as a site for trading human beings. In 1775, New York had more enslaved people than any other city north of Maryland. The routine for a black man in Manhattan was one of constant surveillance. There were the slave codes, which prohibited more than 3 black people from meeting in public. If you were an enslaved person working the docks, your life was a cycle of forced labor under the whip and the secret hope that the British promise of freedom for those who joined the king was real. This racial tension was a live wire running beneath the muddy streets. The fear of a revolt was what kept armed white night patrols walking Broadway after 9 o'clock. The winter of 1775 to 1776 was one of the harshest on record. The Hudson River froze so solid that it was possible to walk from Manhattan to New Jersey. For the population, this was a catastrophe. The firewood supply was cut off. People began dismantling fences and even abandoned houses to burn the wood and keep from freezing. Meanwhile, politics chilled relations. In August 1775, the ship HMS Asia opened fire on the city. Imagine the terror. You are dining with your family and suddenly, an 11-pound iron ball crashes through your roof. The sound of cannons reverberating through Manhattan's low buildings was the warning that the routine of peace had ended. Thousands began packing what they could into wagons. The Great Escape turned New York into a city of empty houses and boarded-up windows. By the spring of 1776, the routine shifted from civilian to military. George Washington arrived with thousands of soldiers from New England and Virginia. The city was occupied by its own defenders. General Lee, Washington's subordinate, gave orders to turn Manhattan into a fortress. The routine was now the sound of pickaxes. Trenches were dug on Broadway. Earthen barricades were raised at the Battery. Mansion gardens were turned into military latrines. The New Yorkers who stayed had to share their homes with unknown soldiers, often filthy and sick. Privacy died. The economy stopped. Every bit of iron in the city, from doorknobs to pots, was requisitioned to make ammunition. New York was holding its breath. In June 1776, the atmosphere was that of an impending funeral. The British Navy began to appear in the bay. First one ship, then 10, then 100. New Yorkers climbed onto rooftops to stare at the forest of masts approaching. It was the end of the routine. The mud asphalt was about to be baptized by fire. The population knew that what came next would not be decided by pamphlets, but by bayonets. The city was trapped between Washington's army, which refused to retreat, and the British Armada, hungry to retake its commercial jewel. Chapter 1 ends here, with the last sunset of a New York that, though imperfect and dirty, was still free in its own colonial disorder. August 1776 was not just hot from the Manhattan sun. It was suffocating from the presence of steel. The routine of the New Yorker who did not flee some 5,000 civilians who had nowhere to go or were too loyal to leave became an obsessive observation of the horizon. From the window of any attic on Broad Street, one could see the sheer scale of the British fleet at Staten Island. There were 32,000 soldiers, the world's elite, against a continental army of peasants and artisans coughing from tuberculosis in the earthen trenches of the city. The constant sound in Manhattan that summer was that of shovels. Washington ordered the city fortified at all costs. Colonial mansion gardens, once the pride of the elite, were torn apart to create mud breastworks. Broadway was cut by barricades made of confiscated furniture and old wagons. Commercial routine died. The only commodity moving was gunpowder. When the cannons finally roared in Brooklyn on August 27th, the impact was physically felt in Manhattan's windowpane. Each distant explosion was a reminder that the time for diplomacy had evaporated. The night of August 29, 1776, defines New York's resilience. Under a torrential rain and a fog that locals described as a veil from God, Washington withdrew 9,000 men from Brooklyn to Manhattan across the East River. Imagine the silence of this operation. Thousands of men marching on rags to avoid noise. Overloaded fishing boats rowing against the black tide. When the sun rose and the British realized the prey had escaped, their fury turned toward the island. On September 15th, the British landed at Kips Bay, modern-day 34th Street. Panic was total. American civilians and soldiers trampled each other in a desperate flight north toward Harlem. It was the day New York ceased to be an American city and became King George III's headquarters. From that moment on, the routine for those who stayed would be dictated by the bayonet. If war was the fear, the Great Fire of 1776 was the trauma. Around midnight on September 21st, just 6 days after the British occupation, an orange glow began to dance on the southern tip of the island. The fire started at Whitehall Slip. The wind, blowing hard from the south, acted like a blacksmith's bellows, pushing the flames into the heart of the city. For the common citizen, it was a night of sensory horror. Wooden houses, dried by an intense summer, exploded into flames before the fire even touched them. Manhattan's sky turned purple. Church bells, which should have sounded the alarm, were silent because the rebels had removed the metal to make cannons. British soldiers, drunk or furious, began hunting suspected arsonists. There are reports of civilians being thrown alive into the flames by soldiers who believed the fire was an order from Washington. By dawn, New York's backbone was broken. Trinity Church was a skeleton of black stone. From Whitehall to Berkeley Street, nothing remained but lonely chimneys, called Washington's Sentinels by the locals. A quarter of the city vanished, leaving thousands of homeless people wandering through the ruins. With the fire, New York's routine turned into a dystopia. The British did not rebuild the city. They used it. The remaining churches were turned into hospitals for wounded soldiers, where the smell of gangrene and death replaced incense. Others became riding academies for the British cavalry, their floors covered in manure where the faithful once knelt. Canvas Town emerged. In the charred ruins of Broadway, the homeless and loyalist refugees stretched old ship sails over the remaining stone walls. There, amidst the rubble and ash that never settled, entire families lived, cooked, and died. The British elite, on the other hand, maintained a surreal routine of gala balls and plays on John Street, ignoring the miseries surrounding their luxurious halls. New York was a city of two worlds, the satin of officers and the rags of refugees. No aspect of the routine of that time was darker than the view of Wallabout Bay. There, the massive black holes of decommissioned warships, like the HMS Jersey sat at anchor. They were the prisons. Thousands of Americans, captured in battle or merely suspected of espionage, were thrown into the lightless holds. The routine on these ships was a body count. Rations were moldy biscuits and rotten pork. Water was drawn directly from the polluted river. Every morning, the guards' cry echoed, "Rebels, bring out your dead." The bodies were buried in shallow pits in the beach sand, only to be unearthed by the next tide, leaving human bones scattered along the coast for New Yorkers to see from afar. It is estimated that 11,500 men died on these prison ships, more than in all the battles of the war combined. New York Harbor became a visual reminder that resistance carried a terminal price. With the city blockaded, legitimate trade evaporated. New York depended entirely on what British ships brought and what Long Island farms provided. The result, inflation that would make any modern economy collapse. A pound of butter cost what a worker took a week to earn. Routine became a desperate search for resources. The black market flourished in dark alleys behind Wall Street. British gold coins were the only reliable language. Those who didn't have them starved or relied on military charity. The city's trees, including the fruit trees from old gardens, were all cut for firewood. In the winter of 1780, the worst of all, the cold was so intense that the bay froze completely, allowing cannons to be dragged over the ice. For the common citizen, the ice was an enemy as deadly as the bayonet. New York was the nerve center of British intelligence, but also the birthplace of American espionage. The routine of an average citizen involved a level of constant paranoia. The tavern keeper, where officers drank, was often an informant for Washington. The Culper ring, operated right under General Clinton's nose. Messages were hidden in coat buttons, written with invisible lemon juice ink, or signaled through laundry hung on a clothesline on Long Island. The routine of doing laundry or delivering vegetables was the perfect cover for the flow of information that would eventually defeat the empire. In New York, no one was who they seemed to be. A handshake or a wrong word in the wrong tavern could lead you to the gallows the next day. By 1782, the routine of occupation began to lose steam. News of the defeat at Yorktown arrived, and British morale plummeted. The city, once vibrant and arrogant, now looked like a wounded animal. British officers began packing their china and paintings. For the New Yorkers who collaborated with the king, the routine of safety turned into pure panic. The harbor became congested not with warships, but with transport vessels. Thousands of loyalists, black freemen who fought for the king, and British merchants fought for space on the decks. They knew that when the British flag came down, the rebels' justice would be swift and merciless. The city was about to change hands again, but 7 years of ashes and floating prisons had changed Manhattan's DNA forever. The routine of New York in November 1783 was not one of celebration, but of a strange, intense calm. Imagine South Street, Seaport. Thousands of British and Loyalists huddled on ship decks, looking one last time at the blackened chimneys of Broadway. The silence was broken only by the creaking of anchors being hoisted. When the last British boat pulled away from the coast, New York experienced something it hadn't felt in 7 years: the absence of a master. The entry of George Washington and his Continental Army through Bowery Road was a reality shock. The army reclaiming the city was not a glorious force of bright uniforms. They were thin men wearing rags. many of them New Yorkers who had left 7 years earlier as youths and now returned as men scarred by war. They marched through streets where the rubble of the 1776 fires still formed mounds 6 feet high. The liberation of New York was the meeting of an exhausted army with a city in tatters, a detail that defines the spirit of that day and the city's routine of improvisation. The British, before departing from the battery, left the Union Jack flying on a 50-foot mast. To ensure the Americans were humiliated, they removed the halyards, the climbing ropes, sawed off the cleats, and coated the mast with hog fat and whale oil. The routine of the Liberation Party stopped before that slippery trunk. It was a moment of symbolic realism. Freedom was up there, but the enemy had made it unreachable. It was John Van Arsdale, a sailor who knew the grit of manual labor in Manhattan, who solved the problem. He fetched nails from a nearby carpenter's shop and, hammering them in, one by one, to create makeshift steps while wiping the grease with sand, climbed the mast under the silent gaze of 1,000 people. When he tore down the British cloth and hoisted the 13 stars, the roar of the crowd was the sign that the city was, finally, master of its own destiny. The routine of the following months was marked by a reckoning. New York had a serious social problem. Who was the true New Yorker? Those who fled and now returned to claim their properties, or those who stayed and collaborated with the British just to keep from starving. Improvised courts sprang up in taverns. Property disputes were often resolved with shouting or at the point of a knife. However, New York realism commercial pragmatism prevailed over blood vengeance. Alexander Hamilton, a young lawyer who had seen the horror of war, defended many loyalists in court. Why? Because he knew that for the city to be reborn, it needed capital and experienced merchants, not a bloodbath. Manhattan's routine became that of swallowing pride for the sake of business. The city chose money over revenge, a trait that would become its permanent DNA. Between 1784 and 1786, the routine of those living on the island was defined by a constant sound, the thud of hammers and the rasp of saws. Manhattan turned into a massive construction site. Where Canvas Town once stood, the first red brick houses in the federal style began to rise. The reconstruction was not just aesthetic, it was a sanitary necessity. Wells were reopened, and sewer ditches which had overflowed during the occupation were cleared by brigades of workers. Many of them former enslaved people now seeking their place in a society that spoke of freedom but still hesitated to grant it. The South Street Market was reborn. Where warships once sat, merchant vessels from China and Europe were now seen. New York was beginning to breathe through the ocean again. In 1785, the American Confederation, the government before the Constitution, moved to New York. The city was now the political center of the continent. Routine changed drastically. Broadway saw the arrival of delegates from all 13 colonies. Taverns like France's Tavern, became informal conference rooms where the nation's future was debated amidst mugs of beer and tobacco smoke. The average New Yorker now lived alongside giants. James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton walked the same muddy streets, dodging the same trash carts. It was in this environment of physical proximity and political pressure that the Federalist Papers were written, most of them in cramped offices in Manhattan by candlelight, with the noise of the harbor in the background. New York wasn't just being rebuilt, it was writing the rules of the modern world. The climax of this documentary saga occurs on a clear morning in April 1789. Federal Hall, on Wall Street, had been renovated with a neoclassical facade to be the nation's first legislative palace. The city's routine stopped completely. People climbed onto roofs, clung to shipmasts, and packed every inch of Broad Street. When George Washington stepped out onto the balcony, he didn't just see a mass of people, he saw the triumph of resilience over the ashes of 1776. He wore a brown wool suit made in the USAA, a nod to national commerce, with his hand on a Bible from a local Masonic lodge, swore to protect the Constitution. At that moment, New York reached its peak. From an occupied and burned prison island to the capital of the first modern democracy in less than a decade. The realism of this moment lies in the fact that Washington was nervous. His hands trembled. He knew the survival of that experiment depended on the stability of that noisy, chaotic city. But New York is a city that doesn't cling to the past. While the federal government was establishing itself, the true revolution was happening under the buttonwood trees on Wall Street. In 1792, merchants and brokers, tired of the chaos of street trading, signed the Buttonwood Agreement. The routine of trading, war bonds for coffee or sugar, gave way to a formal stock exchange system. New York would soon lose its status as the political capital to Philadelphia and later to Washington. D.C., a political compromise Hamilton accepted to ensure the federal government assumed the war debts, but the population didn't care. They had discovered something more powerful than politics. Global trade, Manhattan's routine became, from then on, the pulse of the money that never sleeps. Closing this documentary, we look at the New York of today. Historical realism teaches us that the arrogance and strength of the modern city are scars of a brutal childhood. The streets Washington walked are still there, hidden beneath the asphalt. Trinity Church, rebuilt after the fire, still watches over the beginning of Broadway. The population of New York in the era of independence taught the world a lesson in urban survival. Cities can burn, ports can be blocked, and populations can be reduced to living under tarps. But if the spirit of commerce and human stubbornness remain, iron will always rise from the mud. The routine of that time of struggle, adaptation, and reconstruction is what allows every New Yorker today to walk with their head held high. They are the heirs to the ashes of 1776 and the dreams of 1789.